Hey everyone, it's Len May. I am the CEO and co-founder of Endocanna Health. I am super grateful to have Dr. Chris Spooner and Dr. Ethan Russo join me for this. The reason why I'm recording this is we're in the middle of a study on cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. And there's been a tremendous amount of misinformation on social media all over why we're doing, what the purpose is. So we wanted to have a discussion about the reason why we're doing this cannabis hyperemesis syndrome study and what the outcome is, and to address all these different questions that are being asked. So thank you so much for joining us. Please stay tuned and listen to this. First of all, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time. So Ethan, I'll turn to you first. How did this study come about? What are we actually studying?
Sure. So we're talking about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. This was actually index case. First person was actually in 1996, but it was almost 10 years before it was more adequately described. First in Australia, although it is definitely the case that this is most prevalent in the USA. So this is a syndrome that involves abdominal pain, vomiting, and an unusual behavior of either hot showers or baths that seem to alleviate symptoms. Now, as best we know, this is really associated with high chronic intake of THC. There have been some theories bandied about that it could be due to neem contamination, but there really isn't a scientific basis for that. There have been numerous theories advanced as to how this occurs, having something to do with desensitization of the CB1 receptor in the brain, but the bottom line is we don't know. And the really unfortunate thing is people go a long, long time before getting a diagnosis of this, sometimes years. And I've seen two figures in the literature of expenditures in relation to this, and it ranges from $30,000 to $90,000 in various tests and ER visits and hospitalizations before someone gets a diagnosis. So clearly there's a need, number one, to understand the syndrome better, and number two, having a way of identifying it, because heretofore it's what's called a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning you do a bunch of tests like scans and barium enemas, etc. But if there's no answer, then perhaps someone starts asking questions about cannabis usage. So we'd like to understand this better. I wondered whether there could be a genetic susceptibility to this, because we know that we could have a group of people with similar intakes of cannabis that react very differently. One person has this, another one doesn't. Why is that? How are they different? So could it have to do with a genetic susceptibility? So that's a hypothesis. If it does, where would the genetic change be? And it might be on the genes that encode the CB1 receptor, the psychoactive receptor in the brain, also in the gut, or it could be on CB2, the non-psychoactive receptor that has to do with pain and inflammation in the gut, or it could be related to a third receptor that's part of the endocannabinoid system, which is called TRPV1, TRPV1. And the reason for thinking that is, one of the treatments that does seem to help is if capsaicin ointment, that's the same ingredient in chili peppers, if that's rubbed on the abdomen, that seems to alleviate symptoms for a few hours. So the bottom line is, we're interested in identifying patients who have had diagnosis and the associated symptoms of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, and look at their genome, see if there are any changes in the genetic code on the genes that encode those receptors. So that's a long-winded answer to what was a short question.
Well, you answered like three of my questions in one, so I'll skip ahead. Who is involved in the CHS study?
Okay, well, it was originally my idea. but it's something I discussed with you and Chris at Endocanna DNA as being the logical people to look at this. Being a company that is already focused on genomic testing, and especially in relation to the endocannabinoid system, it was sort of a no-brainer that this would be up your alley, so to speak. And so we're the primary people involved. My associate, Nisha Whiteley, has also helped with development of this. And we should mention also that we put this through an IRB, an institutional review board, what's called an ethics committee elsewhere. And they're very stringent. They look at situations to make sure that there is confidentiality, that there's protection for people who are involved in the study, and so that they're not subject to any kind of harm, whether it be from procedures or that they could endanger themselves by identification. Cannabis still is illegal in some jurisdictions, although fortunately those are becoming fewer and fewer. Still, we don't want anyone to suffer as a result of participation in the study, and that was the reason for going through the formal IRB process, which has been completed, and we have their approval.
How is Endocanna Health involved in the study? That's probably geared more towards me, but I'll also let Chris chime in on that. I should preface that we collected questions from different groups and different online postings that people are asking. So this is an aggregate of all different questions that are being asked related to the study. So some of them may be related to us, Endocanna, some of them may be related to general IRB process. So I'll just read them and we'll see who's appropriate to answer them. So Ethan, as you mentioned, Endocanna Health, we're a biotech company that actually looks at DNA and looks at different patterns, genotype patterns, and how they may be affecting an individual. So yes, you approached us at Endocanna, and Chris, being our chief science officer, is really, really key in terms of putting together which specific SNPs we want to start looking at, which are single nucleotide polymorphisms, which genes we want to see, and then also the design of the actual upfront survey to see who's going to qualify to move forward with the next step is actually get the DNA swab. And so we are involved in the actual process of conducting the survey. The survey is done, and the reason why we're doing it is because we already have a HIPAA compliant, completely anonymized process to do that. The second thing that we do is based on our review board, and you laid out the process for the IRB. We're able to send out the buccal swab to the individuals. They're swab and send back anonymously to our lab, where we'll conduct a genetic sequence, and we will gather that information to see if there is any patterns involved in this. So that's how Endocanna Health is involved in that process. Chris, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure, and I would also just really clarify that one of the things that Endocanna and EndoDNA has set up is all that infrastructure that protects anonymity and safeguards the data as well, which is really super key because, there's been some concern about if genetic data is being used either without people's permission or getting out and somehow that's, the anonymity is broken on that, how does that impact, a number of different factors. So I think that's the other thing to really emphasize is that, we've got the security stuff in place so that data maintains secure and safe and anonymity is protected.
The next question is actually about how your privacy is protected and the security part of it. So I will just answer it this way a little bit more in a more in-depth answer. So there's a couple different pieces that are involved here. The collection device itself that we use is an FDA-approved collection device from DNA Genotech, is called an OCD 100. It's been used in many clinical trials, probably the top device in the industry for collecting saliva samples. Number two, the lab that we use is a CLIA certified lab, so it follows all the CLIA standards in terms of security protection and SOPs that are in place. The third part of that is, as I mentioned, we have a HIPAA compliant process that actually anonymizes the data. So for everyone that is getting a collection device, you have to register your information associated with the barcode that's on the collection device. Once you send that information into the lab, we maintain the information on the Amazon's AWS platform. The information is stored on two different sections of that platform and are encrypted. The reason why I'm explaining this is because if you do not register your collection device, we will not know that that collection device belongs to the individual. So if you send your sample without registering, that information is anonymized. Only the person that registers has the decryption capabilities. So when they get the report, they log into your secure portal and you can read that information. The reason why I bring this up also is because in addition to the study, we have given participants a opportunity to get their full endo DNA report if they choose to do so, which is something that we normally charge $199 for. If somebody wants to see their endo compatibility, they're able to do so. It is not related to the information that we are getting from the study. I just want to make sure that those two things are separate. The next question is your science real?
Gee, I hope so. By way of background, I'm a neurologist. I've been working in the cannabis space, research and development, for 24 years. What we're doing is hypothetical. It is a theory that I've come up with that there might be a genetic susceptibility to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. We may not find anything. It may be that I was right about the idea, but that we need better technology in the future. But if we're right, this has very great implications that'll be extremely helpful to patients and to caretakers in establishing diagnosis early without all the pain and expense that I previously mentioned. The kinds of workups that people go through when they have this syndrome are quite extensive and can be invasive too. So in comparison, taking a swab and sending it in is a much easier process. So we believe that the syndrome is real. It's increasingly reported. And we really hope that we'll be able to help people with this. And that is the prime motivation here.
And Len, I'll just chime in here real quick as well too on, is this real science? Well, this is being applied in the area of pharmacogenomics as well. And this is probably there's an element of pharmacogenomics with what we're talking about here to potentially some extent, which is how drugs interact with various different patients and why you're getting different responses. And that's not just limited to CBD, THC, cannabis. We're also talking about things like antidepressant medications, blood thinning medications, anti-seizure medications. So, the science is obviously evolving and growing. It's being applied in those particular applications. And so now we're just moving this into the cannabis space and seeing if we can, help to clarify what's going on here. So,
is this really free?
Sure. I mean, I don't believe you're taking anybody's credit card or anything else, so I don't know how they're going to be charged. So yeah, the idea is this is research. We're not asking anybody to pay for their own testing. We're hoping that people will be generous with their time and their involvement so we can help answer the scientific issues.
And I would say that I mean, this is something that we've all worked within this community, and we've seen people that have suffered with this as well, right? And I think there's a genuine desire on all our parts to really try and support patients to understand that. So so I think this is something that we're all doing for interest, and certainly there's no financial component to it for us, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and just to add to that, is this really free? Well, it's even beyond that, because we've made a financial contribution on our end to be able to produce these kits, and this is a financial contribution on our part in order to help people as much as possible. So not only is it free, we're investing in that for the sake of science. So as Ethan was mentioning, regardless of what information we get, we have to follow the scientific process in order to get that and the published information. If we're wrong, we're wrong. It's still going to be published. If we're correct, then maybe there's ways to be able to find a solution. And if we are wrong or partially wrong, or maybe there's some pattern that we can use our AI to find, then it'll allow us to check that off the list and say, well, maybe it's not this, but maybe it's that. So This relentless pursuit to trying to find a resolution for it, we're committed to doing so.
Right. And Len, I would just add, already at this point, just with the responses we've had, we have the largest database of information available on cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. The prior biggest case series came out of the Mayo Clinic, and it was in 98 patients, and we've far exceeded that. So we have a great deal of information already that we'll publish in any event, even if we strike out on identifying genetic underlying cause to CHS.
So are you trying to sell me something?
Well, not if money doesn't change hands. As you mentioned, people have the option to get what would be a $190 test, get the results for free. So we hope that's a little bit of incentive, and some people will opt in and others may not. But the idea isn't to sell anything.
And at the end of the day, once they have the genetics, your genetics are your genetics. It's not like you need to do multiple tests on that down the road. So I think it's the value part of it already happens with the information that they're getting out of the trial.
Yeah, so that leads me to the next question. What will you do with my DNA? Are you going to sell it? Your DNA is anonymized DNA. We will provide, as we kept saying, we will use that DNA to find any genotype patterns, to be able to associate those genotype patterns with cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. We also, in addition to that, as a thank you to the participants, are offering our standard EndoDNA report, which shows a lot of different genetic predispositions that are related to the endocannabinoid system that may not even be cannabis specific. You're able to utilize that and learn, or if you choose not to, that's fine as well. So your DNA is utilized for that specific purpose only, and not for any other purpose or reason, just for this specific study on cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. Are you benefiting financially?
Well, I think, Len, that obviously we're a company, we provide this service. I mean, we're also very interested in the science behind cannabis and trying to understand, the mechanisms of action and, and sort of expand the knowledge base on that. If we do that, does that create some reputation for us as innovators, as being, good corporate citizens, and trying to sort of expand the science? Then I think that's, I think any company that's working and doing stuff like that, I mean, that's something that they strive for and trying to make sure that, they can create that reputation. But at the end of the day, people have a choice of what they're going to buy. And certainly, there's not a product, that goes beyond this, that's going to generate, anything beyond that for us. So, yeah.
So how are patients selected to participate in the study?
Well, we had an extensive questionnaire, as I had mentioned, and We went through this thoroughly. We wanted to see what kind of evaluation people had had, what their cannabis intake was, what kind of cannabis. We also had an extensive set of drugs that people might or might not be taking. We wanted to rule out drug-drug interactions with cannabis that might be an alternative explanation for having the symptoms of CHS. In the end, we decided to send kits to people that had an established diagnosis of CHS, but also fit the major criteria for it, having all the symptoms and signs of it, so that we would have people where we were sure that they had this. So that would be the group where we're saying that they have cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And then we also would choose some people who quite apparently do not have CHS. That would be a comparison group to see if there are differences in the DNA between people who have the syndrome and people who do not. And that's really it. So we were very stringent. There were people that may well have this, but didn't have the classic symptoms or some other reason. But we never had the names of anyone, never looked at any of that. It was really totally based on the answers to the questionnaires.
And Len, I'll just add in here a little bit. I mean, working with patients on a day-by-day basis and trying to explain, how evidence is developed and how we evaluate evidence for when we're using it with patients, it's a very confusing situation. It's a very confusing process for people to understand. And part of the challenge is when we're dealing with these types of questions, how does that get published? How is that looked at in the research community? And that is, how is that regarded, and what's the repute of the study? And so in something like a situation like CHS, which is one of these things that there's a lot of confusion, and there's some derision about it as well too. Does it exist? Does it not exist? We have to be very diligent and strict and stay to some very strict criteria, so that makes the validity of the study something that can stand out and can actually be looked at and referred to. So it's frustrating for patients because when we ask a question through a research study, it's a very specific question that doesn't it's not designed to be an open-ended question. It has to be very focused, and so that does mean that the selection criteria and the exclusion criteria have to be applied consistently across the board. And even if we let just one person and make one example, or one person come in and not go through that, then that calls into the question the entire results of the study. And again, I appreciate that it can be really frustrating for patients and for people that are like, hey, I have this, I've experienced this. And for say maybe you haven't been using cannabis and now you're not experiencing those symptoms, or maybe you were never accurately diagnosed with it, then that would have been one of those things that may have excluded you from that process. And again, unfortunately, there's just no way for us to kind of work around that. Maybe at some future date or something, we can take a look and revisit that down the road. But for this first step, that's what's required.
Why are you doing this if you're not making money?
Well, I'm sorry for laughing, but this is a scientific investigation. My problem my whole life has been innate curiosity. I was the kid in second grade that spent most of the year in the hall because they asked too many questions. Well, I'm asking a question now, and that is, what is at the root of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, and can we identify a genetic cause? If I never make money from this, but we identify the reason behind this and can help people, I'll be very happy.
We have a lot in common, Ethan, which is that putting out in the hall for asking too many questions is definitely one of them. I always thought it was probably my ADD, but that curiosity is it's insatiable. So I completely concur with what you said. Are you telling CHS patients that they can use cannabis again?
I've never done that. It remains to be seen whether there might be some type of cannabis that would not produce the symptoms. But that isn't established. One of the reasons we asked so many questions about the type of cannabis and the analysis of the cannabis that people were using was to see if we could tease out any patterns. But no, I mean, I encourage people to use cannabis when they have a specific reason, something that they're treating, and when it helps. We don't ask anyone to persist when it's creating problems for them. So that would never be the case.
I think just to add to that from EndoDNA standpoint, there may be a little bit of confusion because individuals that are participating in the study have access to their EndoDNA report. And in the report, it talks about their genetic predispositions to cannabinoids and terpenes. This is a general report that is not specific to the CHS study that we're working on. This is something that they can explore for their own curiosity if they choose to. If in some way this is connecting them to a trigger that they should be using cannabis again, they can choose not to opt in and look at the report and not to log in and review that information. This is strictly unrelated to the CHS study. I just want to emphasize that. How can I trust this?
Well, I hope after the explanations that we've provided that people will feel a little more comfortable. If they do not after these explanations, I guess it's very simple that they choose not to participate. But we really need people's help with this. Obviously, we need a good database of people that qualify for the study so that the results are going to have greater scientific validity. So this is something we're requesting of people and hope it'll make sense after these explanations.
When can I see the results of the study? From EndoDNA standpoint, the process takes about 4 weeks from the point that your sample reaches the lab. That's how long it takes to sequence the information and have the information ready in our secure portal.
And beyond that, if we see results that indicate a genetic abnormality, then certainly we'll want to publish this. And because we have so much information from the questionnaires, we'll be trying to publish this in any event. So it'd take a while to write up. I hope maybe a couple of months, and then it has to be submitted to a journal. And that's subject to what's called peer review, meaning that it's got to be reviewed by 2 to 4 outside experts, make sure that they're satisfied, correct any errors seen or imagined. And then sometime after that, it would be online electronically and then eventually printed in a journal. So that's a process at best. It would take about 4 months, or it could be a year or more. Sometimes you have to submit to more than one journal because they're not interested in the topic. But I'd say a year, but hopefully less for that part of the process.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to emphasize as well, too. There's a peer review process as we submit it through to the journal. And what are they going to be looking at? They're going to be looking at our methodology, how we handled the data, the types of questions, our exclusion criteria, et cetera, et cetera. So it goes back to the question earlier about, we need to be diligent and we had to follow a very strict process. And so by doing so, that is going to help us move it so that we can publicly put this out and help people understand what's going on and publish this data.
Ethan, Chris, I want to thank you so much. I'm truly honored to have partners like yourselves going through this with the same passion for the plant and, helping people. At the end of the day, that really unites all of us because that's what we're here to do, is try to help as many people as possible, through plant medicine. I wish you guys best of health and stay safe. And thank you again so much. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Take care.